All right, so we'll start with the fact that the United Nations was actually launched before World War II ended, and the United States joined it in October. The war was over in August 14 and 15 of 1945. We'll get into a little bit of that, but I wanted to start off by saying that my name tag, and a lot of you folks here know me as Jack McManus, but my name is John. And I always say, if you meet me at the airport, please don't say, "Hi, Jack." You would get in trouble, and so would I. The United Nations exposed, how the U.S. entered and why we should withdraw. Now you see there that my title is President Emeritus, right? I was president for 20 years or so, and then I kind of stepped aside, and there's a new fellow that's president. He's a good friend of mine. I'm glad he's there. They looked at me and they said, "You're getting old. We're going to make it easier for you, so you're now going to be emeritus." Thank you. The commonly held attitudes about the United Nations: that it never accomplished anything, that it's a forum simply for people to go and blow off steam, that it needs to be reformed, that they had to get better leaders, but they do feed hungry children, and it's a place to talk rather than fight. Well, that's the standard responses that you'll get from people about the United Nations. The most oft-repeated attitude, of course, is that it's a place to talk rather than fight. Now, let's suppose there's a nation that has a fight with one of its neighboring nations, right? Do you go to the United Nations where there are 193 members and involve all 193 in this fight between two nations? Isn't that stupid, right? Let the two nations figure it out, and even if they go to war, let them figure it out by themselves instead of involving the whole world, right? So that argument doesn't hold up. And we also have an ambassador in almost every other nation in the United States, 193 ambassadors, yeah. So if we have a problem with another nation, why don't we have our ambassador handle it instead of going to the other 192 nations? It's very simple. But they don't think that way because they have a goal, and the goal is world government. Submerge the sovereignty of the United States and get us into a world government. All right? The second most oft-repeated attitude about the UN is the UN never accomplishes anything. But the UN employs tens of thousands all around the world. Are we to believe that these UN workers are doing nothing? For instance, here's the United Nations headquarters. How many have ever been to UN headquarters? Quite a few, all right? So you go there and you see this huge building, and it's full of people doing nothing. No, it isn't doing nothing. They are doing plenty, right? Here's the International Monetary Fund. That's the United Nations. That's a pretty good-sized building. A lot of people there doing nothing. No, they're not doing nothing. They're doing something. Here's the International Labor Organization in Switzerland. Here's the World Health Organization, again in Switzerland. Here's the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands, right? These are big buildings. And they don't sublet it to other people. It's full of United Nations employees. Tens and hundreds of thousands of these people all over the globe doing United Nations work. Here's the World Bank. We're back in Washington, D.C. Now, we have other large offices. We have the Food and Agriculture Office of the United Nations in Rome, and the Seabed Authority in Jamaica, and the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Austria, and the Maritime Organization in London, and the UNESCO in Paris, plus other agencies and organizations in Tokyo, in Bangkok, in Montreal, in Nairobi, all over the globe. The only place they don't have an office is Antarctica. They don't like cold weather, I guess. Yeah. Now, let's contrast our country. If somebody came to you and said to you, what does it mean to you to be an American? Here's your answer. There's your answer right there. The Declaration of Independence says men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted. Everything's in excuse me, in its proper order. God's on top, individuals next, government's on the bottom where they belong. Right? There's no other nation like it. That's our country. So if anybody says, you know, you can go to anybody, ask them, what does it mean to you to be an American? And if they don't mention this from the Declaration of Independence, they're missing out. They haven't been taught correctly. All right? The Constitution of the United States came along. Congress shall make no law regarding this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and all these different things. And then we have the marvelous 10th Amendment that says if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right? Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN says that they have the same document that we have in our Declaration of Independence. But does the United Nations recognize God's existence? Absolutely not. You will not find the word creator or God or divinity or anything regarding our supreme leader. So the United Nations says everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. Right? The United States says Congress can make no law except those that are the power is given in the Constitution. So the contrast between our country and the United Nations is it's a chasm. You can't jump over it. You can't ignore it, and you shouldn't. Now, in 1966, they came out with another big document and made a big spiel about this. And they listed a lot of the rights that you and I like, and the rights that are mentioned in the Bill of Rights. But then the UN says rights may be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law. Right? What does the United States Constitution say? Congress shall make no law regarding these fundamental rights. Right? It couldn't be more different. The Constitution of the Soviet Union was the same as the UN. They didn't recognize God. They said rights come from government. They said they could cancel the rights at will. So we see polar opposites here. We have United States with God, rights from God, and no law can cancel. And on the right, we see the United Nations. No God, rights from government, and they can cancel all the rights by passing a law. Right? It couldn't be more different. And we should never have gotten involved in the United Nations. The godfather of the UN is a man named Edward Mandell House. He was President Wilson's chief advisor. He wrote a book called Philip Drew, Administrator, and he's got a quote in there from Giuseppe Mazzini, which is significant, but that's another story for another speech. He advised President Wilson and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Right? So the guy is a communist Marxist. He lived in the White House. He advised President Wilson every single day. He advocated the income tax and the Federal Reserve System. We got both in 1913, the first year of the Wilson administration. He proposed world government. We've already had some discussion on that. He proposed the League of Nations, and the United States Senate said no. Thank God they said no. So then Edward Mandell House launched the Council on Foreign Relations. The Senate vote in the League, they debated the matter for 9 months, and they said no. Thank you. I just got that out of my car and it's pretty warm. The Senate debated whether we join the League of Nations in 1919 for 9 months and said no. Now keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about how long it took to debate the UN, right? Here's a book that supplies the answers, Shadows of Power. I don't know if we have them here, but that's a book I highly recommend. It's about the Council on Foreign Relations. World War II for us started in December of 1941. That's the bombing at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. We got involved and declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on us, so we responded and declared war on them. And that's the last time we declared war. It's also the last time we won a war. And that's related, right? If you don't declare the war, you don't win it. And that's the way we've been going for all these years. During 1942 up to 1945, they started planning the United Nations. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, right? Our military was getting geared up to fight. Our men were going down and enlisting. 1 month after Pearl Harbor, they formed a declaration of the United Nations. Who did that? The people we call the deep state did that. In 1943, the United States, the United Kingdom, USSR, Soviet Union, China, and others agreed to form a world government. In 1944, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Dumbarton Oaks is a great big villa meeting place in Washington, D.C. And they created the initial draft of the UN Charter. 1945, San Francisco Conference, 50 nations sent delegates, and they produced the United Nations Charter. War in Europe ended on May 6th of 45. Senate approved entry into the UN July 45. Japan surrendered on August 14th, 45. All right? So the founding of the United Nations occurred between May and July of 1945. The U.S. delegation was led by this man, Alger Hiss. He was later found to be a Soviet spy. He was a communist agent. There were 16 other communists who were part of our delegation to the founding of the UN, and there were 43 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I've already told you, you should read a book called Shadows of Power. It's about the Council on Foreign Relations. The chief authors of the UN Charter were the Soviet communist Andrei Vyshinsky and the American communist Alger Hiss. In 1945, the Senate voted to join the United Nations. Way back in 1919, how long did they debate whether to join the League of Nations? You remember? 9 months. So they debated whether to go into the UN for 6 days. They said no in 1919. They said yes in 1945. And the vote in the U.S. Senate was 89-2. Only 2 senators said no. Only 2. And I'm sure you've all heard of Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota. Everybody knows all those. No, hardly any audience I ever speak to, even well-schooled members of the Birch Society, have never heard of these 2 men. But I went and dug out the speeches that they gave, and they were absolutely on track. They knew what the UN was. They knew we shouldn't get involved, and it was good. There was a diplomat named J. Reuben Clark. He said the Charter is a war document, not a peace document. Makes it practically certain we shall have future wars. It removes the power of the U.S. government to declare wars, which we haven't done since 1941. To choose which side to be on, right? Somebody else tells us which side we should be on. Determine the equipment we should use. Command our sons to do the fighting, right? That's what we're up against, and that's what has happened because of our membership in the United Nations. Okay, let's look at the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter of the UN is smaller than the Constitution of the United States. It's fewer words, in other words. Article 1 uses the word peace 6 times. So they go around, they tell everybody the UN is a peace document. But Article 2 authorizes war. So are they a peace document? No. Is it a peace document? No. Right? The UN Charter discusses application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. So you go to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, what does it say? It authorizes demonstrations, blockade, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. That's war, right? So war is authorized by Chapter 2 and Article 2 and Chapter 7. Now, let's suppose you're a senator in the United States Congress, and they pass around the UN Charter, and they ask you to read it, and they ask you to sign it. So you read it, and you get to Article 25. The entire article is printed here. It's a very small article. It says the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present charter. That trumps the Constitution, right? If you believe that, you cannot swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States legitimately. How many have done that? All of them. All of them do that, and they all accept Article 25 of the United Nations. That's only one very good reason why we should never get involved. Article 43, where do we get the troops the United Nations uses? It says in Article 43, all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council, that's an agency of the United Nations, Security Council, armed forces assistance and facilities, including rites of passage, necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Right? So all member nations, when the UN calls on the world, are required by Article 43 to send troops. Most of them don't do it. But there's one nation that does it all the time. It's ours, right? UN operations here, there, anywhere around the world are usually carried out by the United States military, right? They don't wear blue helmets, they don't have blue arm patches and so forth. They have the uniform of the United States, but they are doing the UN's bidding, the UN's work. Here's a man who was a Secretary of State of the United States. This is an incredible statement. He said, with respect to U.S. policy, when it comes to our role as a member of the Security Council, we are obviously bound by UN resolutions. He should have been fired on the spot. Happily, he was removed from that office before the year was over, but they put another man in place, and it's the same. Didn't change. President George H.W. Bush, Papa Bush. It is the sacred principles of the United Nations. Wait a minute. Sacred principles? Isn't that a bit over the top, right? It is the sacred principles enshrined in the UN Charter to which the American people will henceforth pledge their allegiance. Not this American people, right? And not you folks either, right? The UN is something we ought to get out of, and if we did it tomorrow, it would be soon enough for me. Right? The United States then passed the United Nations Participation Act. This happened in December of 1945. Remember now, the UN was started in the summer of 1945. They had their first formal meeting in October in Queens County, New York, at Lake Success. And then they passed the United Nations Participation Act. The date is significant. On December 20th, many of the men in Congress and women had gone home. They had gone home to be there for celebrating the birth of our Lord, Christmas time, and so forth. So they quite frequently bring up a measure that they want very much. And so the United Nations Participation Act, here's a congresswoman from Illinois, Jessie Sumner. She said, this measure gives us congressional authority for surrendering the American people to an all-powerful super government. Good for her. She's right on. The United Nations Participation Act, then, Congressman Fred Smith from Ohio. This measure strikes at the very heart of the Constitution. It provides that the power to declare war shall be taken from Congress, and it has been. Here is the essence of dictatorship. The United Nations Participation Act was passed December 20th, 1945. Now, I'm old enough to remember this period, right? When the United States Senate voted to go into the UN, I asked my dad, should we do that? I was 10 years old in 1945. Now you know how old I am, right? Right? I asked my dad, and he said, well, we had World War I, we had World War II, we don't want to have World War III. Let's give it a try, right? And that's the way it was sold. It was sold to the American people as try something different, right? They didn't know enough about it. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who had originally voted for entry into the UN, finally in 1948 said the UN is a trap, let's go it alone, right? Here we see regional arrangements, NATO and CETO. How many of you are aware that our forces fighting in Afghanistan are under control of NATO, right? Show of hands, how many? Well, just a handful of people know that, right? NATO is part of the United Nations. And if the United Nations doesn't put uniforms on people, blue uniforms and blue hats or whatever, they control it with NATO. And NATO is in control of what happens in Afghanistan. They also had another group called CETO, S-E-A-T-O, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, carbon copy of NATO, and it's under that we went to Vietnam and we lost the war, right? Thank you, United Nations. Secretary of State Dean Acheson said NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. Absolutely. Korean War started in 1950. North Korea invaded the South. UN Security Council said all members send forces. The U.S. supplied the bulk of the troops. No declaration of war. Tremendous casualties. They went to President Truman. Where are you getting the authority to send military forces into someplace without a declaration of war? And President Truman said, we are not at war, this is a police action. If I can send troops to NATO, I can send troops to Korea. And he did, right? But some of the generals that came back from that war, the Korean War, he said that you get into war to win it. You do not get into war to stand still and lose it, and we were required to lose. We were not permitted to win. General Douglas MacArthur, he was our leader in the Korean War. And he quoted the Chinese general. The Chinese troops joined with North Korean troops, and they very nearly obliterated the American military, but the American military hung on. So Douglas MacArthur then quoted the general from China, who said, I would never have made the attack and risked my men and military reputation if I had not been assured that Washington would restrain General MacArthur. General MacArthur was restrained, right? Who was ordering General MacArthur not to win the war in Korea? State Department people, United Nations? Yes, absolutely, right? So Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which is no longer in existence, did its job and then they let it be canceled. Vietnam War rules of engagement. This is actually the requirement on our troops. Now, I was a Marine Corps officer. I didn't serve in Korea. I didn't even serve in Vietnam, but I was ready to do so. But the rules of engagement that were handed down to our troops by our own government said don't attack enemy planes on the ground. You have to wait until they're in the air and they're attacking you before you can attack them. That actually, what? Don't attack a truck convoy if it goes off the highway. All the truck had to do was to go 100 yards away from the highway, and then it was forbidden to attack it. Right? Don't close Haiphong Harbor, where all the troops, supplies for the North Koreans came in. And Barry Goldwater, Senator, said these rules unquestionably denied a military victory. Right? The First Iraq War, 1991. Right? This occurred right after the bombing of the Twin Towers in New York City and elsewhere. And President Bush said the Gulf War crisis has to do with a new world order. And that's what they're after, a new world order. When you hear that phrase, you should go, wait a minute, new world order. That means world government. I'm not interested in that. I don't want that. Right? First Iraq War stopped suddenly. Why did it stop? Because the Security Council authorized only the forcing of Iraq out of Kuwait, neighboring Kuwait. Second Iraq War in 2003. Here's a letter to the UN Security Council from our ambassador, John Negroponte. The actions being taken are authorized by existing council resolutions, including 678 and 687. So no doubt about it. The war in Iraq was a UN operation. He said it. Now, there's a principle involved here, and I want you to try to remember this. One seeks authorization to act from a superior, not from an inferior. Right? Who's the superior that we ask authorization from? The United Nations. We are the inferior. Right? And that says it very clearly, what has been going on. I don't like that. I want my own government to be the boss of their attitudes and their actions and so forth. I don't want to have to go to the United Nations for authorization to do anything. The Afghanistan war is under NATO, even today. It's only 17 years old. Oh, don't worry about that. We'll fight on for 17 more years. Doesn't matter. Until the UN says we can come out, we don't go out. Right? So the Korean War UN flags were flying over our troops. The Vietnam was under SEATO. Desert Storm, UN authorization. Second Iraq War, UN authorization. Afghanistan War, NATO in charge. Is the UN running our military? Absolutely, no doubt about it, right? I wrote a book called Changing Commands, and I think they have them for sale here, right? So Ron Paul, in October of 2002, he stood up at the International Relations Committee, the House International Relations Committee, and he said, Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. What is it, Ron? I move that we declare war in Iraq, and I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Way to go, Ron Paul. Right? So what happened? The chairman of the committee, Henry Hyde from Chicago, Ron, he said, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. Your message is inappropriate, anachronistic, it isn't done anymore. Imagine, right? And he was called a conservative Republican. Right? Doesn't mean anything. Right? State Department document 7277 called for us to turn over our military to the United Nations. Document called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations called for us to turn over our military to the United Nations. We haven't done it fully, but we have done it in part. Gun foes want civilian disarmament. Now, if you go to the UN headquarters in New York City, you will see in the courtyard a huge pistol with the barrel tied in a knot. You see that on the picture, right? The barrel's tied in a knot. That's gun control. They want gun control. So what's interesting is that is not a military weapon. That's a Colt revolver. That's a private weapon owned by the people. That's the one they want. They want people to stop using, and if they could, they'd turn every one of the barrels and put a knot in it. Right? Gun control. Mrs. Mark, Senator Feinstein shoots off mouth, hits foot. Good, glad. We're glad that happened. Now, there's something else about the UN Charter, and that is Article 2, Paragraph 7. It says, nothing in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of any state. So anything that happens within our borders is our business, and the UN is not authorized in any way to come and meddle in our affairs. But they do it all the time. Here's the United Nations organizational chart. Where did I get that? I went to the United Nations. They were handing them out. I said to the guy, can I have some more? Right? I have friends, I'd like to give one. Right? They gave me a pile of them. I came home and I went through the copy machine and made a lot more of them. Right? So we find, if we look at this organizational chart, we find the UN's tentacles in education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military, science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, and on and on and on. Everything. The United Nations is involved, and that's what all those people in all those buildings are doing, right? They are carrying out mandates of the UN, and they're doing a good job of it, right? The UN Refugee Agency designates who is a refugee and proposes which country must accept the refugees, right? We're at a point now where the UN could come and say, we have to accept 50,000 from who knows where, right? Somalia, or any country at all. In 2016, President Obama wanted to accept 85,000. Thank goodness he got stopped. In 2017, there are plans laid for the U.S. to accept 100,000, and Donald Trump has said no, absolutely not. Good for Donald Trump. Is the UN intervening in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction of our country? Yeah. They have chided the United Nations for having laws against abortion. What laws we do have. They have interrupted the mining operations. They have talked out against capital punishment. They don't like the fact that we are building a wall for border control. They don't like some of the judicial decisions. I think they're going to like less of them now that we're going to have a new justice of this. And they certainly don't like the idea of the American people being left to have arms of their own. So they're intervening everywhere, and it's wrong. The cost to the United States in money, well, total fiscal year of 2010 was $7.7 billion. They're intervening with Agenda 21, proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. Effective execution will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced, right? So we fight against Agenda 21. It's a stealth operation. They want globalism for your children. They have Common Core in the schools via UNESCO. So we have new 3 R's. We used to have reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now we have recycling, racism, and reproduction. Right? From Agenda 21, we go to Agenda 2030, and that means they want to have this all accomplished by the year 2030. The European Union, originally only a trade agreement, and then it became the European Economic Community, and later named the European Union. 2004, it grew to 25 nations. It's now 28 nations. But Great Britain, the UK, has decided to pull out. And for that, we are very, very happy. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is a poster that the UN was using, and Bill Jasper, one of my colleagues, went to Europe, and he went to the European Union headquarters, and he got a copy of this poster, right? On the left, you see a painting from a Belgian artist named Bruegel, and it was in the 1600s, I believe. On the right, you see a modern depiction of the same thing, and they are rebuilding the Tower of Babel. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, if you know your scripture, you know that nationhood began at the Tower of Babel, right? Some people wanting to build a tower to challenge God Almighty and have a world government. That's what Babel was all about, right? So what happened is God confused the tongues, and the people who could understand each other went over here and formed a nation. And the people who could understand other tongues went over here and formed another nation. Nationhood began at the Tower of Babel, and it was a construction of God Almighty, and therefore nationhood is good, world government is bad. That's biblical. Right. I'm getting signals back there to wind it up. Many of you have heard of Jacques Cousteau, the nice little man with his boat, the Calypso, traveling around the world. And he's a savage. I'll state that very clearly. Look what he said. It's terrible to have to say this. The world population must be stabilized, and to do that, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day until we get down to 1 billion from 7 billion. That makes him, in my estimation, a complete and utter savage. Right? He contributed to his own design, however. He went and died. Robert Welch said, the key, get us out. He once said, withdraw from the UN and you have broken the back of the world conspiracy. Right? James Lucier said the first job of conspiracy is to convince the world that conspiracy does not exist. Right? That's true. Conspiracy surely does exist. Robert Welch said, there's a conspiracy at work as sure as there's a law of gravity. So, America's leaders are not stupid bumblers, right? America's leaders know what they're doing and what it leads to. Ergo, there is a conspiracy. They don't tell you the whole goal. Conclusion. The United Nations is not taking over the United States. The United States is being delivered to the United Nations. That's turning the whole thing around. And we've got to stop it. And every one of you can help. Conclusion number 2. Membership in the UN is completely incompatible with an independent U.S. and freedom for the American people. So what should be done? Should the UN just be reformed? No. Should the UN simply reduce its payments? No. Should the UN have a new Secretary General? Doesn't matter. Right? The only sensible solution is what this billboard says: get us out of the United Nations. That's a billboard that it was down in between Tucson and Phoenix in Arizona. So, House Resolution 1205, the American Sovereignty Reservation Act, it's a measure to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations. Right? Introduced by Representative Mike Rogers of Alabama. He's got some co-sponsors, but not very many. The John Birch Society, on the other hand, is rock-solid information, 5 decades of experience, sorely needed national organization, and a plan for victory. The JBS plan in a nutshell, I won't go over it. Now, I wrote a little booklet, and we have them for sale over here. It costs $4, but at the camp it costs $2. So if you will, get yourself a copy of that booklet, and then when you read it, you might want to get some more, and there's information in there about how to get more. This is about how the U.S. got in the United Nations in 1945 and why we should withdraw, and the sooner the better. Commonly held attitudes about the UN are wrong. It's not just a forum for blowing off steam. It's not somebody that never accomplished anything. It's not something that just needs better leaders. And it's not a place to talk rather than fight. The choice is ours: less government or world government. U.S. Constitution or UN Charter. God or no God. These are the choices we have, right? A better world or a new world order, right? So you people can get armed. And when you go to school and they start telling you how wonderful the UN is, raise your hand and say, I would like to disagree. I don't think the UN is wonderful. And take some of the information that's in that booklet and use it. Put it to work. Can it be done? Absolutely. More JBS members are needed. Robert Welch said, come and join our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. And that's the message of the John Birch Society. Thank you very much for your attention.